If not, all in favor, say aye.
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 Any opposed? All right, thank you. All right, so now we're going to jump into, we just have two informational presentations today. The first one is an overview of the Mobility Hub's feasibility study. And I will let Andrea jump in and take over.
Okay, yeah, Tyler, you can go ahead and hop to the next slide. So I'm going to be talking about the Mobility Hub's feasibility study that's just about wrapping up. This project, it's the results of a multiple agency effort. So it was Cascades East Transit, the Bend MPO, and the City of Bend that had originally come together and submitted a joint application to ODOT's Transportation Growth Management Program to fund this study. Next slide. So I do have quite a few slides here, and these are the topics that I'll be hitting on. So what is a mobility hub? I think most of you are probably at least somewhat familiar. Why mobility hubs in Bend? I'll go over the project outline and time frame, the objectives that were developed with the study, the market analysis that was done, and then as a result of that, the location recommendations, and also mobility hub types and features. I'll talk about implementation, and then the public engagement work that CET had completed, and then finally, current and next steps related to this project. Next slide. Okay. So what is a mobility hub? Well, primarily, mobility hubs are places where people can access multiple modes of transportation and easily make connections between public transit and other mobility options. And I say primarily because mobility hubs can also include a number of amenities as well, to make them more attractive places, things like food and beverage, for example, and a couple other things to keep in mind is that mobility hubs are intended to make using transit easier and more efficient. They can be scalable. They can be a strategic approach to managing personal vehicle demand, parking, emissions, and they can also be implemented through public-private partnerships. So why mobility hubs in Bend? Well, they were identified in both the Bend Transportation System Plan and in Cascades East Transit Master Plan as a way to move away from the current hub and spoke transit system that exists today to create a more multi-centric network that would then help to reduce pressure on Hawthorne Station, help to increase efficiency, so fewer transfers would be needed, making trips quicker and more direct, and also offer last mile options that improve access to transit. And then whether or not you're actually using transit, they increase other transportation options in Bend, reducing reliance on cars or single occupancy vehicles, reducing vehicle miles traveled and emissions. And although mobility hubs were included in both of these plans, there were a number of questions about how to actually implement them. So next slide. So we had some key questions of the study. So a number of questions, a number of needs. For example, we wanted to know how other agencies implemented hubs and what we could learn from that. What were the key takeaways that we could apply to Bend. What's the current and future market demand for mobility hub services in Bend? So what kinds of services are most likely to be successful and serve the greatest needs for Bend? And what defines a successful mobility hub specific to Bend? So what are the underlying land uses, transportation facilities, community factors like demographics that should be used for evaluating potential hub opportunities in Bend? We also want to know specific types and features for mobility hubs that would make sense here. So what should they look like in the context of Bend? And how should improvements be phased and built upon over time? We also needed to look at, assess near and long-term opportunities for implementation. So location, funding, private development, and we needed design guidance and implementation strategy that included phasing opportunities. And finally, developing performance measures specific to a pilot project that could then help inform future mobility hubs. Next slide. So here's an outline and a time frame of the study shown in the graphic at the top. We definitely had a really aggressive schedule. We had 6 TAC meetings to review 5 different tech memos, and also a draft final report that was just recently produced. We had a pretty large TAC that was made up of members of CET Standing Committee, their Regional Public Transit Advisory Committee, as well as other individuals that the city and CET staff had requested based on their expertise. Also, as part of the study, CET headed up a number of public outreach events, as you can see in the bulleted info on the lower right-hand corner there. And I do have a slide later in the presentation where we'll get into more details of that. And if anyone has any questions, along the way, just feel free to raise your hand. Although, Hobie, could you help me? Because I can't actually see if people have their hand raised.
Absolutely.
Okay.
I'll tell you.
Next slide. So one of the first things that the study did was to develop objectives. And this was done by using information in the Transportation System Plan and in CET's Transit Master Plan, and also from key takeaways from our first memo, the best practices memo, where we looked at what other agencies have done. So objectives included create a decentralized transit network. We want to increase transit accessibility and equity for all users, focus on placemaking, identifying public-private partnerships, creating context-dependent, scalable, cost-effective hubs, and reducing reliance on single occupancy vehicles. So these next couple slides that I have go over the market analysis that was done. And I will say that they're also reflective of me attempting to summarize like over 80 pages of tech memos and a mapping application that included a lot of data sets. It really was, I would say, very comprehensive. But this graphic gives a high-level overview of the methodology that was used to assess current and future demand for mobility hubs and services. So number one, looking at our existing mobility network, so transit, our bike ped system, and existing mobility services. Second, identifying some market factors, so demographics, community factors, physical criteria, transportation needs. And then next, assessing market opportunities. So who would be most likely to use hubs? So existing riders, who are future potential riders, trip types and needs, trends and highlights like impacts from COVID. And then finally, establishing evaluation criteria and performing a mapping exercise to help us locate the most prime locations for mobility hubs. So an outcome of the analysis was identifying market opportunities as far as the types of riders and the types of trips most likely to be served by mobility hubs in Bend. So number one are what we called all-purpose riders and equity populations. So these are primarily existing riders who depend on transit as their primary mode of transportation. So serving this group really should be a priority for near-term mobility hub implementation. New investments should focus on improving convenience, safety, and access for people that use transit today. Second on the list are tourism and recreational riders. There's been a really strong and persistent demand for CET's recreational shuttle service, even throughout the pandemic. So being able to tap into this market is an important strategy for attracting choice riders to the transit system. Third is intercity trips. CET's Community Connector program, that saw the smallest drop in ridership at the initial stages of the pandemic and then rebounded faster than any other service. Fourth are choice commuters. So CET's Transit Master Plan, when it was being developed, it analyzed, that project analyzed commute patterns, and this showed that the highest priority needs of commuters included well-timed transfers or single-seat transit rides. So a more multi-centric system as a result of mobility hubs that would reduce the need to transfer, combined with mobility hub amenities that would help to close these first and last mile gaps to places of employment, would be attractive to this user group. Next, we have students, and here it's OSU Cascades and COCC. They are the highest trip generators in Bend by car and by bus. And finally, major employers. So in the market analysis, areas in the city with the highest trip demands coincided with the highest employment densities. So also as an outcome of the market analysis was identifying potential partners that might be interested in mobility hub development. So these would be entities that should be approached when looking at implementing future hubs. And I will say that the project team has already started some of these conversations. Next slide. So with the market analysis, evaluation criteria was developed to help identify the best locations for successful hubs. So this was looking at proximity to existing or planned transit service, access to the bike ped system, which I'd already mentioned, community factors, so population density, employment density, low-income households, households without a vehicle, older adults, and then looking at land use and development potential. So existing or projected density, levels of current activity, zoning, and redevelopment potential. So, when combining all these or applying a score to them, what does this look like? And that's what's on the next slide. So again, when you apply scores to the criteria, here is what rises to the top as far as potential priority areas, which are shown in red. But this was our first step. We did further refine that with input from the project management team, the TAC, and the public. So the next slide then shows the finalized location recommendations for mobility hub areas. So you'll see there's 8 in total, but 1 really exists today, and that's Hawthorne Station. And then there's 4 that have a dark purple outline, and those are the recommended near-term or priority mobility hub areas. So the east side of Bend, downtown, COCC, and OSU Cascades. And then after that, we have the south end of downtown, like Old Mill, Corpine, and then 1 on the north end of town and 1 on the south end of town. So near term is around 2 to 5 years, and looking at longer term areas, 5 to 10 years. But we did definitely include a note in the study that this doesn't have to be in order, as opportunities arise. Next slide. So next was the development of mobility.
Andrea?
Yeah.
Rick has his hand up.
Yeah, Rick.
Hey, just curious, looking at the map,
Mhm.
that southeast quadrant, we've got Stevens Ranch and the Elbow. I guess the gateway would be closer to the thumb. But when we look at the proposed development in the city, it seems like, for future out years, that there should be something in Southeast. Was there a discussion about that?
Yeah, there was a discussion about that. But if I remember correctly, it was that it's still pretty far out.
Okay.
And that these other areas would be more of a priority, at least today.
Okay.
Yeah, and Rick, if you look at the map that's up now, you can see that Stevens Road was not included in this analysis.
Oh, okay. Okay. Thank you.
Because I think that was, that process, this project started before, I mean,
that happened.
the Stevens
Yeah.
Road Master, the planning process started shortly after this got started. So there wasn't data available, I don't think, at that time to at least to pull in that piece of the Southeast area.
Yeah.
Okay. That makes sense. I was just kind of like, was it excluded purposely, or was it more of this is a kind of, there's a need, but it's outside the planning horizon? So.
Yeah, good question, Rick. Thanks.
Okay.
Helping
Thank you.
clarify that.
Yeah, and Andrea, if I could chime in, so, we did have some questions about this, and we actually got a call from the Bulletin about it because they thought we were going to be building a mobility hub in Stevens Ranch, and so, I connected them with Allison Platt at the city, and I think really, what we're doing now is we're trying to work with the city and with developers, so when they do come into new areas, at a minimum, we're having some bus pads and transit stops go in so they can, develop those for us. It's a lot more efficient when they could do that. But, I think thinking about a future development that is going to be more dense in the future, it would make sense for us to work with the developers to, if there's a community area or some kind of parking area that we could maybe potentially have some input into the design to be able to really easily come in after the fact and put in some kind of mobility hub infrastructure. That would be ideal. So it's really kind of setting up the conversation and getting the alignment between the city, the stakeholders, the developers to really kind of, think in a more forward way about what this community is going to look like in the future and the things that we can do now to not have to tear something out and rebuild it later. So it's kind of really setting up those conversations, but it's a good question.
So next was the development of mobility hub types and features specific to each identified location. So the study developed 3 different types based on the location's surroundings. So we have a major hub, secondary hub, gateway hub. So a major hub would be like downtown, Hawthorne Station, Old Mill, Core Pine areas. Secondary would be at the colleges, university, as well as East Bend, the medical area there. And then gateway hubs on the north end of town and the south end of town. For the 8 locations, a packet of what we called cut sheets were developed, and these recommended different features and elements that should be included at various phases of development. So phase 1 would be a lower investment, and then bumping up to phase 2 elements and phase 3 elements. And these were the features and elements were recommended based on each location. So this picture on the right is a snippet of one of the cut sheets for the downtown location, just to show you an example. But I know it's kind of small, and I do have a visual to kind of give you a better idea of this. So that would be the next slide. So here's an example of what phasing could look like. So phase 1 would be some initial elements. So some space for bike share or, shuttle pickup drop off, some wayfinding and information, dedicated, Uber Lyft spaces, and then moving on to a phase 2 example, which would be more enhanced elements. So maybe some landscaping, secure bike parking, additional amenities, food trucks, some real-time transit arrival information, covered shelters. And then phase 3 is an example of, here is an example of full build out. So the main thing here is the addition of an actual structure, a transit center type building with bathrooms, Wi-Fi, maybe some, dedicated EV charging spaces, and some improvements for pedestrians.
Robin has her hand raised.
Yeah, Robin.
So on your image, instead of the curb, I guess bus pullout, if you had the bus in lane and you had the floating bus stop, you have so much more space to put your amenities within that sidewalk area instead of doing a pullout. Unless this is meant for like dwell time.
Well, I mean, this is kind of more of just a general example, but for like specific design details, I'd have to defer to, is Andrea here yet? Maybe not, but would be CET.
Andrea is here. She's
Okay.
up. Yeah, sorry. I just didn't show her, but she should be moving into panelist. And her hands up.
Maybe-
And Peter's up next.
Okay, Andrea, or Robin, could you repeat your question? And then I think Andrea could provide a response to that.
Okay. So for, transit operations, just keeping them in lane and having the floating bus stops helps better. They don't have to get out of traffic and then try and get back in traffic. And then coupled with that, if you have the floating bus stop, you have more room on the public realm side to have more amenities and things like that, because your sidewalk doesn't have the 14-foot bus bay. So just kind of reflecting on that, unless this is meant to show that there's dwell time with the bus, they come in and they sit there for a long time and then they leave. So those.
Yep, and sorry, I wasn't able to speak on the other mode. Yeah, so for the most part, what we look at is a case-by-case basis on how the streets are designed for pull-out locations. Where we tend to kind of pull in, to kind of give you examples around Central Oregon, we have a pull-in for a Safeway in Madras based on the street design, people loading groceries. You have a longer loading time. It made sense for that particular location. The developments along 15th Street here in Southeast Bend with the schools and Allenglow Park, we opted for pull-in based on the activity of kids crossing the street and going to the parks and the school. So it's not really like kind of a blanket, structure that we would apply. It really is based on the land uses surrounding it that we would either opt for a pull-in or not at all.
Yeah, I'm just trying to get more floating bus stops on some of those routes. And it's harder because no one can visualize what the floating bus stop is. And their first default is the pullout. And we don't always want to pull out. But that's what everyone, we've showed them in all our graphics. And that's what people kind of just their base default is. And so it's a little bit of education. So maybe even just adding a note in your document that there is such a thing as a floating bus stop. I don't know.
Yep, absolutely. And that's, one of the first questions that designers will ask us. We will have absolutely no pullouts here on 3rd Street in Bend because it would just be incredibly difficult for us to pull back into traffic. However, we did just implement a new pullout next to a Bi-Mart in between Warm Springs and Madras, again, because of the loading time, groceries, and the safety of those individuals on US 97. That's where it was designed with proper, lanes to pull back into traffic. So the majority of stops obviously are not pullouts, but there are a few exceptions based on land use.
All right. Thanks, Andrea. Peter Russell, go ahead.
So one of the things I was wondering, just because, I play more in county zoning. So are you going to have to tweak city code to allow food trucks at bus stops, or do you guys allow them in your zoning all over? Or do you are all these being placed in areas potentially that would allow them into the zoning anyways, the food carts?
I believe they already would be allowed, and that would be something separate. So it wouldn't be, right now we're working with the city on amending some code language around the results of this study. I touched on the last slide, but we don't actually have language in there that specifies food truck spaces because that would be a separate project or permit.
Yeah. Yes, because I know one of the things I've noticed from the food carts we've had in the county, like we'll give them, like the one in Sun River, we'll give them a huge bike ped credit for getting their sides driving, but they're not, they become less and less like a McDonald's where, you know, you see McDonald's, you're already on the road and you pull in. Now they become destinations in and of their own right. So there may be implications of a food cart there you might not have expected.
Well, I do know. So, hey, Andrea, is the food cart at Hawthorne Station up and running?
We hope Martina will be here by next week. We're just working on some electric. But just we went through the process here. The individual did have to get a permit through Deschutes County's health services, and then also sign a contract with COIC. So we've navigated that as our first experience of having that non-permit permanent truck on our facility. So I'm learning a lot through that process. It was quite difficult, but I think we're almost there.
Thanks.
Are there any other questions?
I don't. No hands are up.
Okay. All right. Next slide, Tyler. So the point of this slide is to give a visual example of where we are today and what we are looking to move towards. So I'm not sure if everyone is familiar with the new mobility points program that the city has begun to implement. So mobility hubs are focused on transit and enhancing transit, while the city's mobility points are more focused on micromobility, which today is bike share. And the two definitely complement one another, but you know, a mobility point doesn't necessarily have to be located at a transit stop, while a mobility hub definitely does. So this graphic shows how Bend's future mobility network would be made up of major hubs, secondary type hubs, and include mobility points. Next slide. Okay, so public engagement summary. So CET really, or Derek, did a ton of work, public engagement for this project. So there were in-person events as well as an online survey. And this is not all the information that was collected, but kind of the top two, which are location preferences and amenity preferences. And the responses are pretty different from the in-person versus online survey, although some are similar. So for example, from the in-person events, and I'll let Derek talk to this after I just go over this, but from the in-person event, the top three location preferences were East Bend, the north end of town, and downtown, while the online survey, the top three were downtown first, and then areas south of downtown, so like Old Mill, Corpine, and then the east side of Bend. And the top three amenity preferences with the in-person events were number one, covered shelters, followed by real-time transit info, and then secure bike parking. While on the online survey, the top amenities were number one, on-demand transit shuttles, followed by bike share, followed by food and beverage. And hey, Derek, could you expand more on that? Or maybe I'm assuming people are probably wondering what, the difference is.
Yeah, so the in-person events, we had kind of more of an interactive display where they could just kind of check a box on a big laminated sheet of paper, the locations that they wanted. They could pick three. And the online survey, they were asked to pick three, but they could select as many as they wanted. And in terms of the locations, we did a lot of we did an event at the Food for Less on the north end of town. We did an event in partnership with the library at the mobile homes up there, like north of Roble Road, where there's a big Spanish speaking audience. and got a lot of feedback up in that location. And so there was a little more focus on like the north end of town in terms of where we did the outreach. So you could see the community members, wanted some things closer to them. So that's my theory of why there's a little more preference for the North Bend in the community outreach as opposed to the online survey. And then I think most of the people from the online survey, it was pretty representative of Bend. I think it was weighed more toward kind of an East Bend kind of and Southeast Bend location because we asked where people live in Bend.
That's good.
And then some people from a little bit outside, but most of the people were actually from Bend, a few different kind of visitors that were taking our survey. And we also did some events in the Old Mill. So that was where you kind of, I think, see some of that preference. And then in terms of the amenities, we had a more exhaustive list of amenities in the in-person outreach, and we narrowed it down in the online survey and made them rank them between, I think like 6 different choices. And there's also some other data, from the online survey that, as Andre mentioned, gets at, what kind of modes would you use? What are your motivations, to use mobility hubs? And a lot of that can kind of feed into the overall analysis of like what's really getting people excited about, mobility hubs. And probably a lot of people don't really understand what on-demand transit shuttles are. I think they sound really cool. So that was probably why people selected that. Obviously, bike share being relatively new and being rolled out at the same time the survey, there was a lot of media attention toward the bird bikes being out there. And so that probably prompted people to flag that one as a main choice. So but yeah, I think combined, this was just a way to really get some good feedback in terms of like, once we build these things, A, where do you want them to go? And B, what kinds of things do you want to be able to use them for? And what kind of amenities you want? We weren't really wanting to ask people about the overall design and these technical aspects. It was just a pretty easy way to engage people and get them, pique their interest in what we were doing.
Thanks, Derek.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, if there aren't any questions, we can go to the next slide here. Oh, okay, so current and next steps. So pilot project development. CET is currently in discussions with the city for a possible downtown pilot location. Still some more, work to do on that, but, if feasible, then we'll need to start reaching out to neighboring property owners. Next, and we're working on incorporating the results of the study. So the city is currently drafting amendments to the development code and the comprehensive plan. So CET and myself are helping with that as far as incorporating the results of the study. And then it will be amended into CET's transit master plan as a technical appendix that is scheduled to happen next month. Pursuing the first major mobility hub site. So CET currently has funding available to purchase a phase 2-3 site. But I do know those dollars need to be spent by 2024. So I think they're hustling to try and find a location. I know they have a realtor retained for that. And then continuing and future discussions with developers and property owners. As I mentioned before, there's already been some conversations happening, and we need to continue those.
Andrea?
Yeah.
Does the city's TSP need to be amended as well?
Yeah, so what we're doing is we're replacing the map that the TSP had produced that showed sort of the conceptual locations for mobility hubs with the map that I showed in this presentation, the map that came out of this study.
Great, thank you.
Yeah. Next slide. And that's it. So we do have CET is hosting the project webpage, and I imagine that'll be up for some time, but all the tech memos, the mapping application that was developed for the feasibility analysis is on there. I believe the draft final report, which has not been finalized yet, is up there, and then the final report will be up there as well. And that's all I have. Oh, Robin.
Sorry, one more question.
Yeah.
So on your map, and we had that brief discussion on a point on the southeast. If there's anything that you would like to be discussed during master planning, things like that, or subdivision plans, I would put it on the map as tentative or something, or, you know, future with discussion. Just because then you can get the developer to start thinking about that area as they're creating their plans.
Okay, yeah, good point. And we have been, the city has been engaging, well, Andrea and myself in some of the master planning work, and we hope that will continue with Southeast too. But yeah, thank you.
I have a general, I guess, kind of I know the project was focused on Bend. Will there be any, I guess, how difficult will this be to replicate in the future for, you know, say Redmond or other communities, you know, that, you know, within Central Oregon?
Yeah, so I'll take that one, Tyler. You know, even without a lot of leading from CET, Lapine is actually building their hub as we speak. We believe construction will be ending this fall, winter. It's at 4th and Huntington. And we helped the city of Lapine secure funding for that construction. The city of Sisters is actually already in design efforts for their multimodal center. And so conversations, I've got the team focusing a little bit more in Madras and in Prineville to explain what we're doing here in the city so that those cities as well can start to replicate what we've been doing. So I'm actually quite surprised at the progressiveness of the other cities without us leading that conversation.
Yeah, and I also think Warm Springs has potential. There's a commissary site that they're thinking about those food carts and, you know, putting our transit stop there. So, you know, I think these are, you know, it's nice that these are scaled. You have this kind of phase 1, phase 2. I see a lot of those more rural areas not being the full blown restrooms, you know, but kind of the curb cut with a few amenities and access to transit and, you know, a focus on some kind of safe bike ped access to get to those. And I think that's really important, is making sure that urban form is accessible and provides for that safe access. I think that's something critical that, you know, needs to come along with these as we build them.
Excellent. Great. Thank you.
And Tyler, just to add, we did write kind of those scalable hubs within our master plan for the other cities outside Bend. So it's written in there as well.
Okay. That's what I thought. I just couldn't remember. So thank you. All right. Any other questions for the team here? All right. Excellent. Thank you all. Next up, I've got Derek is going to talk about CET's, I think, recently completed electronic technology feasibility study. I'm just going to switch presentations here.
While you're doing that, Tyler, I just wanted to tell the group that Rachel Zackham joined from CET, and also Robin Vora is on the call as well. So welcome, you two.
All right, Derek, I'll let you take it away.
All right, yeah, so this is a study. We applied for a Pacific Power grant. Through that grant, we hired a consultant. They're called the Center for Transportation and the Environment. They do a lot of work with transportation, transit agencies, transportation entities in terms of transitioning fleet to electrification, and also looking at some other potential alternative fuel sources to have a low or no emissions fleet. And so this study was completed, I think around the spring. It was about a year process. We had a big stakeholder kind of partner group. There were two big community wide presentations. And so we had a lot of it. It was on a more regional effort. So it was kind of involving some of our stakeholders and partners, not only from Bend, but throughout the region to really give input into this. Hobie, go ahead.
Oh, you're muted, Hobie.
Sorry. I just wanted to see if Tyler's sharing the screen. We still see those item 5 slide from the old presentation. Just want to make sure everybody's seeing it. Yeah.
You seeing it now?
Yes. Perfect.
Okay.
Thank you.
Yep, you go to the next slide, John. And so one of the main reasons, why we're wanted to do this study is to start to get a roadmap of what's feasible with our current fleet, our current routes, our current system. Where is the potential to transition our fleet toward electric or even towards some kind of alternative fuels that we could potentially utilize. We have an interest in reducing our reliance on fossil fuels. Currently, we have combustion engines. They're running off kind of a B5 diesel, which is a little more environmentally friendly, but our goal is to make sure that we're doing our part to have a lower footprint in terms of our fleet and our emissions. And as we're talking about mobility hubs and infrastructure, what would we need to design in terms of any kind of charging infrastructure, even for micro-mobility? I think that's important. If you have kind of e-bikes and electric cars, that people could rent, as well as looking at our fleet needs. This study didn't really dig into that in depth. That would probably be another study that we would need to do. This was really exploring our fleet and the potential of transitioning some vehicles toward lower no emissions. And so also, as many of you know, we're redeveloping our Hawthorne Station parking lot or redesigning that. And potentially, incorporate some EV charging infrastructure into that process as well, although it is really expensive to do that. It requires a lot of work. So this is kind of a roadmap to help us get from not knowing a whole lot about electric technology and battery vehicles to getting more information that's going to kind of lead us down the right road. And in terms of like a lot of the grants now, especially on the federal level, they have a lot of kind of low emission categories. So to be more competitive in those grants, we want to get more in this space to be able to start to move the dial in terms of our fleet and not, using combustion engines entirely. And then this is a photo of LTD. They've switched to electric buses. This is in Eugene. They do have some kind of electric microtransit vehicles that they used as well. So those are just some examples of what that looks like. Now, they're pretty slick and quiet. Yeah. Next slide, please. And so some of the, as I mentioned, the project objective was to really get a first strategic roadmap for fleet electrification. This allows us to get a sense of, what our routes look like, how much, the mileage between the routes, looking at if we were to put a battery electric vehicle with a battery on it, like how well would it do? And so they basically analyzed every single one of our routes and services, looked at the size of our vehicles. We basically have our large buses are 35 feet, or cutaways, which are those kind of dial-a-ride buses and shorter dial-a-ride buses, were the two main areas of focus. And then also the operating conditions, as we know, Central Oregon has pretty cold winters and hot summers. And so when you're running the AC in the summer and the heat in the winter and you're going up hills, things like that, that really impacts the battery life. And then there was also a financial analysis that looked at some projected costs of transitioning our fleet which I have a couple slides at the end that provide those details. And so, as I mentioned, there are a lot of factors that affect the range of, they call them ZEBs, zero emission buses. So we have, a lot of hills, we have a lot of mileage. Our service between, Redmond and Prineville, covers quite a distance. We also have our service that goes all the way up to Warm Springs. And then the Mount Bachelor service is a really steep grade going up to the mountain. Of course, ridership impacts the life of the battery. The more passengers that we have on the buses, the heavier the bus is, and the less battery life it will have throughout that run. And then we have heating and cooling, which I mentioned earlier. Battery degradation over time. Those batteries are going to wane and are going to need to be replaced. And then how the buses are driven. There's a lot of training that comes with not only operating an electric bus, but also the charging infrastructure, getting the maintenance team to all be on the same page. You don't really want to charge your batteries too much, and you don't want to let them drain on the way down. So there's kind of that happy medium of maintaining kind of the healthy battery life. So it's a big learning curve in terms of training, maintenance, and facility use. Go ahead. And so basically they came in and the consultant came in and they looked at all of our buses and they modeled these three main scenarios, which is kind of an overnight depot plug-in charging only. So that's the buses when they return to the, authorization or Bear Creek, which is where we currently keep our fleet, or the Redmond facility, they would, get charged overnight and then they would be deployed the next day. And that would, expect them to last the entire day throughout the service and then come back in the evening. So that was the first scenario. And then the second scenario is a kind of an overnight charge. Plus, during the middle of the day, you have plug-in, the ability to plug in buses and then kind of using some electric heat. And then the second one is the midday plug-in with using diesel heat. There's not a big difference in terms of the feasibility with the electric heat versus the diesel heat. You have maybe one or two buses kind of shifting in that, feasible, likely feasible to not feasible. And I have some charts that show some of the data, but they were pretty conservative estimates. They wanted to make sure, that their modeling was in strenuous conditions and kind of setting that as the bar, because typically we're either in the summer or the winter. And so there are a lot of, they didn't want to give us saying everything's feasible and then we go buy the stuff and, our batteries are draining at a rapid rate. So there was a conservative angle in terms of some of the modeling and the study. Next slide, please. And so here we have our large buses. And when we say blocks, that means runs. So it's like kind of your typical run between, the depot and doing the route and then coming back. And so they looked at all these, and across the bottom, I know that's hard to see, these are kind of our recreation. CC is community connector, BFR is bid fixed route. And then we have some dial-a-ride and some of the other ones, but I did kind of summarize in the top to look at, so for our large buses, our 35-foot buses, Ride the River and the Lava Butte recreation services are the most feasible. So the feasible is the very left in the green. It's not, a very big portion of this. And the reason those are is because they're really short routes. Ride the River is just going between Old Mill, Drake Park, it's doing kind of shorter runs. And then the likely feasible are these kind of shorter community connector routes, which is our regional system. So the route between, Sisters and Bend would be ideal for that. And then some of the Bend fixed routes, like some of the shorter routes, like Route 1, Route 4. And then our new routes that we haven't implemented yet, routes 8, 9, and Bend are listed in there as being likely feasible. We also have some of our mountain service that kind of pops into that likely feasible area. And then the ones that are not feasible are longer community connector routes, like, between Madras or between Warm Springs and Madras, and our Route 31, which is the Sun River to Levine. It's a lot of miles between those routes and not a lot of infrastructure that you could charge it, to do. This is an overnight charge only. So it kind of gives you an idea of like which of our fleet could be transitioned, and you see in the green that pinpoints to maybe some recreation services that are maybe shorter trips. Next slide, please. And then once you start to put a midday charge in there, you really see the feasibility kind of expand. The green becomes more prominent on the graph, and that's going with like some more of the community connector routes, more of the Bend fix routes, and the Mount Bachelor shuttles are now becoming more feasible. And the midday charge is estimated at 30 minutes. So it's kind of pulling your bus out of service for 30 minutes. And then you have to kind of wrestle with okay, well, what does the bus do?
Yeah.
When it's going, you have a second electric bus that can come, or you use a conventional bus to make that run. So the midday charge definitely means we have to look at maybe doing some different time points with our schedules or rerouting some bus, and it'll force us to kind of have to look at our system as a whole to see how we could manage operating an electric bus. But you definitely see with the midday charge, and like I said, with electric heat and diesel heat, not a whole lot changes in that, and we have all the graphs in the report if you wanted to kind of reference what diesel heat would do versus electric. Next slide, please. And then, so now we're looking at our smaller buses. So these are kind of the 15-foot cutaway buses. We are navigating toward these smaller buses. And it's just a general rule of thumb. I mean, we don't need these very large buses, except for kind of our high capacity corridors where we have a lot of ridership. So they're just more maneuverable. They take up less space on the road. They're easier to kind of get around. So you see the feasibility for that is a lot of our dial ride buses. So the BDR has been dial ride. You also have like a Redmond to Sisters route would be feasible under that. And then the likely feasible would be these Redmond deviated flex routes that we're planning. We're actually going to bus stops for those next week. And those are kind of shorter routes within the city of Redmond that we've planned out with our STIF funding. And then, this is just all from a single overnight charge. And I think one of the issues with the smaller vehicles is I thought there would be a high feasibility on those, but they just don't have the space to put a large battery. So you're kind of, you have a lighter vehicle, it's smaller, but there's also less room for battery space. And so that's one of the challenges. But I think, the industry is progressing. There's a lot of advancements in the technology. And, it's expected that those cutaway vehicles, the batteries will get smaller and smaller and be able to work in these cutaways. So I think that's kind of a good fit in the future when the technology is there to start, incorporating those into our smaller fleet. Next slide, please. And so this is kind of a summary that gives you an overview of the feasibility. So red meaning not feasible, green is feasible, and that orangish kind of yellow is the likely feasible. So you can really see, like, for an overnight charge on the left-hand side, we don't have a lot of feasibility with our thin routes, except maybe the ones that are short distance, but the recreation services and the dial ride and the deviated flex routes start to kind of see more potential for that. So it really gives us kind of a sense of, okay, if we are going to invest in electric vehicles and we are going to put these on our routes, where do we want to start first in terms of this implementation strategy? This just kind of gives you a good idea of overall how all these align. Next slide, please. Okay, so what does this mean for CET? So, the recommendations from the study indicated that our community connector and our recreation services and those routes would be good starting points. And I think that's where we need to look first in terms of transitioning any type of fleet to electricity. And we also have, these blocks that are running the cutaways, which are the 15-foot buses. As I mentioned, they're a little more difficult to transition just because of the batteries are so large in those buses, and they need to be scaled back to size them in. And then on route charging could increase, the feasibility. But and as they were doing the study, we hadn't done the mobility hub feasibility study, so there was a little bit of a gap in terms of that communication. But I will note in the report, it kind of talks about the different types of charging infrastructure. So you have kind of a more simple system where you could just plug the buses in. There's these overhead systems for the large buses where the bus pulls in and it comes down and it charges it from the top. And then there are these kind of mats that, you know, you can put a bus over and it charges it. They're all fairly expensive. The first, you know, overnight kind of charging being the most simplistic would be the one that we would probably opt for in terms of like our facilities. Next slide. And then, you know, just some things to note that the technology is improved. Oh, I think this was the same slide, so sorry.
Oh, yeah, it is.
Okay, sorry. So next steps. So, you know, in addition to this study, we're also exploring some other alternative fuels. So there's compressed natural gas, there's renewable natural gas, there's propane. They tend to be a little less expensive, but they're still kind of relatively new. So we're keeping our eye out on transit agencies that are starting to convert their fleet. I do know that some of the early adopters for electricity, they're having issues with, you know, in terms of their infrastructure, in terms of being able to get parts, even getting vehicles is really challenging, as you know, with the supply chain issues. So, you know, we're kind of taking an approach where we're exploring a lot of different ideas. We're folding this report, you know, into our knowledge of the subject and trying to kind of come up with the best solutions. And you know, as we design mobility hubs and we look at the infrastructure needed for charging, that's going to give us a better indication of, you know, what we can do in the future. You know, and I think one opportunity is maybe, you know, the next iteration of Ride Bend, if we're doing some kind of micro transit and using a van, you know, that's going to require a smaller, you know, charging infrastructure setup, you know, where we could maybe more easily roll out some electric vehicles, you know, things like the summer service between Mount Bachelor and the Cascade Lakes, you know, putting a depot up at Mount Bachelor, and, you know, seeing if we could do some kind of electric vehicle there, maybe working with Visit Bend to help support some of the finances around that. And so these are kind of ideas that we have. This is where we are right now. We're not going to go out at this point and start to buy a bunch of electric buses. We need to probably do kind of a facilities plan and maybe do another study that looks at what kind of infrastructure that we need, because the report touches on it, but it doesn't really go in depth about the cost for all of the charging infrastructure, and it's fairly expensive. And then I have a couple of cost slides. So capital costs, you know, right now the ZEB is the zero emission bus. The ICE is our current fleet, so that's internal combustion engine. So you see, you know, a full transition is, you know, gets you down to the $40 million mark, and that's a lot of money. So this kind of gives us a scale of, you know, in terms of us forecasting costs for any kind of transition. And this is like all basically electric. There's also some hydrogen capabilities with buses that we could potentially explore as well. But it kind of just shows us that, you know, it's a significant investment in terms of the charging infrastructure, as well as just purchasing the buses themselves. There's one more slide on costs, and this is just kind of life cycle costs, like, you know, in terms of maintaining the vehicles and things like that. It definitely gets progressively more expensive. You know, I mean, our mechanics are used to working on combustion engines, so when you have an electric fleet, you've got to bring in people who know how to work on those vehicles. Parts are more expensive. There's the whole issue of maintaining the life of the battery, and it's just kind of on a different technology level, you know, that we would need to get to be able to make sure that we're implementing these and using them in the best way possible. And I'm not the expert in this subject. I've been versed with just working with the consultant and hearing some of their presentations, but this is, you know, a little bit new to me. I think Andrew's a little more versed in the electric technology, but, you know, we're happy to answer any questions. If there are things that we can't answer, we have the consultant. They did a great job and they're really communicative with us, so we can always ask them questions. My goal is to push some of this information out in a press release. So I'm working with Pacific Power. I'm getting that out in the next month. to just kind of frame up what we discussed today, you know, that this study is helping inform us. We're looking at different models and different fuel types, you know, and we're going to probably end up having to do another study that looks at the infrastructure side. And so just kind of a lay of the land in terms of where we are and what the findings from the report were. So happy to answer any questions.
All right. I see Robin Vora has his hand up. You want to go first, Robin?
Sure. Hey, thank you. I assume with any of this, that this would be with the electricity coming from a renewable power source. I mean, it wouldn't be the current 70% fossil fuels that, you know, Bend's power, that you would have a solar or some other way of providing power for these electric batteries.
Yeah, that's a good point. Andrea, is Andrea still on? She might be able to. I don't think we had talked about, you would need probably a lot of solar to make these, to charge these batteries. I mean, I think in the future, yes, I mean, we live in an ideal climate where we could have that. I don't think that was factored in there, but it's a really good point. I mean, there are a lot of environmental costs in terms of battery manufacture. You know, when you have a dead battery, then what do you do with it? You gotta get a new one. And in terms of the electricity itself, there are definitely trade-offs. You know, it's going to take energy to, you know, fossil fuels burning to create some of that electricity. Right. And that's something that we've got to consider. So I'm going to, Andrea, you have a better response to that question.
Yeah, so just to let you know that this study will lead to further in-depth studies on potential infrastructure needs and upgrades to Pacific Power and the transmitters. So we have not looked at that, but that is the next study, kind of a deeper dive. This was simply a route analysis at this point and general cost, but that will be the next phase of a study like this.
Thank you.
Cameron and then Peter.
Cameron?
Yeah, I wanted to know what BEV stands for.
That it's battery electric vehicle, which I believe is the same as, it's kind of like right under the zero emission buses. There's just a more specific term. So you're doing battery electric, which is, you know, there's all these like kind of acronyms. It just kind of follows under the electric bus category.
Ah, okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Mr. Russell?
Well, Robin asked the question I was going to ask. So I will say that was a really nice presentation. I enjoyed it.
Thank you. It's fun to learn
I will
about
say,
these things.
in terms of true environmental kind of net zero, we are exploring the world of renewable natural gas that does capture methane from the Tillamook dairy farms and pipes it down into areas of Central Oregon. That would be your true kind of net zero. So we are looking at RNG as a potential way to be more environmentally friendly. So that's another area we're exploring as well.
Yeah, and we're also working on getting some solar panels installed at our Bear Creek facility as part of a grant that I most likely just to kind of offset some of the, you know, the computers and things like that. It wouldn't be set up for a charging station. I think you would need a pretty massive system to be able to charge buses. But nonetheless, I think it's a good starting point for us to really start to think through, you know, solar and how we can incorporate that in our facilities, especially looking at mobility hubs, having, you know, solar panels there. Last week, we had one of the policy managers for Lyft come and do a presentation at our statewide transportation options meeting, and they're actually looking at, you know, developing charging stations and mobility hubs for electric bikes, electric scooters. And they do a lot of kind of the work in Portland for the Bike Town program and the electric scooters and things like that. So we definitely have a resource to go to in terms of like charging micromobility fleet. I think that's a kind of a good segue into the mobility hub conversation. You know, you have a lot of electric bikes and scooters, and how do you keep them charged? You got to pull them out every night and bring them somewhere else to charge them. You know, you charge them en route from where they are to bring them back to the station. And so that's kind of a good conversation to start having now before we design these. And we do have a partner at Lyft that's willing to kind of help us think through those issues, so.
I have a quick question. You know, the bus capital costs on this slide, you know, when you look at the very bottom line there, they're, you know, 3 times what your current capital costs are. Is that cost estimate based on current, I mean, how expensive things are today? I mean, I would assume that going forward, you know, 5-10 years from now, that those capital costs will start to come down, you know, as the manufacturing capacity ramps up and, you know, you just have more of it out there. Was there any do you know if there was any, did the team or the consultants consider those costs, you know, starting to come down at some point in
Yeah,
the
I think they
future?
were kind of like current costs as of last year. They didn't project, you know, a big, like, kind of, this is what from inflation, you know, would show us, because you could probably, things are probably a lot more expensive now, but in the end, they would likely come down. But I think it was kind of a simple modeling that looked at kind of like today's costs, or, you know, 6 months ago's costs, and didn't really tie in a lot of you know, inflation and, you know, decreasing costs. They reference it in the report that, you know, as more agencies get on and more of these are being made, they're going to be cheaper in the long run. That's kind of assumed, I think.
Okay.
But I don't know if that was factored into the report or not. And when you see FCEV at the bottom, that is the fuel cell electric battery.
Okay.
So that's what the fuel cell technology.
Okay.
And
All right.
Tyler, and to the rest of the group, this is an area that I'm going to need assistance in navigating. And at the state level and the federal level, the majority of the grants that are being pushed through Washington are electric. And so as an agency, even if RNG and CNG are more feasible in terms of our realities, that funding may not be geared towards those types of alternative fuels. So this is an area that's tricky for me in figuring out how we maintain that purchasing power for such large capital costs. So I don't know if there will be a shift to all alternative fuels, but the grants are heavy on electric, very light on everything else like propane, CNG, and RNG, which may have to dictate the direction we go as an agency.
Well, I guess a question for you too then is, I mean, because the situation of CET is not unique in the sense of, I mean, the vast majority of the US is rural. I mean, in the sense of the services that are being put out there by small transit operators throughout the country. Is APTA or others going to be, are they going to be pushing on kind of that issue to start making, you know, opening it up so that we have CNG and propane and renewable natural gas, some of those things being more in play with some of these, you know, particularly the federal grants that are out there? Have you heard anything?
I have not. Northwest Gas Alliance is pushing for that, which is represented here in this region of the country. I will say bluntly to this team, I envision many of our support and smaller vehicles going electric in the next 5 to 7 years. Our larger transit vehicles, the ones that do carry your 40 to 50 passenger, it does not quite make sense. And the manufacturing is not up to what we'd like to have for those larger transit buses. So that's where other alternative fuels are coming into play. But I don't know, Tyler, at that level, if directions are being pushed differently.
Yeah, I was just curious. I mean, because I think, and I know some, you know, there's going to be folks that aren't going to be happy with that kind of interim fuel, if you want to think of it that way. But it seems as though that would be, the technology's been out there for quite some time, right? You know, and it's being utilized here in Oregon pretty successfully. I know down in the Rogue Valley. And it just seems as though that would be really applicable through, particularly for the transit systems throughout the country that are, you know, really serving more rural or dispersed areas.
Yeah, and I think, you know, a lot of the attention gets paid to the big transit districts that are in the big cities. You know, I know Portland has a massive electric fleet that they're rolling out, and you know, they're on hydroelectric, so their power is a little cleaner. And so they can kind of defend that choice. And I know it's, there's a lot of those systems in the bigger cities, but I think the local jurisdictions are just kind of starting to get their feet wet in more rural areas about, how can we start incorporating this if there isn't the charging infrastructure? How do we even do it? And the vehicles are very expensive. And so there's an upfront cost as well, though they can potentially be covered by grants. But I think the other thing is just being able to train your staff how to manage the new networks and the systems with batteries. I mean, that's kind of a whole nother level of expertise that you got to bring in and make sure you're not, that the vehicles are performing well and they're taken care of. So that's I think those are the considerations. But yeah, in terms of the other alternative fuels, I'm on the Oregon Transit Association board. I can definitely flag that as a topic to see what the more rural providers are transitioning to, and if there's any opportunities to have grants to get some of that technology on our fleet, as well as we wait for the batteries to become more efficient, for more charging infrastructure to be, I guess, more common and easier to utilize for fleet.
Yeah, and I think, because my concern is I could see with that real emphasis from the federal government on batteries, smaller and rural systems, in a sense, being shut out of those grant opportunities. And there's an equity issue there.
And the state, a lot of the state grants as well are no too. There's criteria with the stiff vehicle purchases where you're checking the box, having a electric vehicle purchase, and I don't know what not checking that box does. It's kind of some new criteria, but that's something that we've raised, as an organization, that to have some kind of fair, more equitable way to evaluate proposals if we don't have the means to be able to implement that new technology. Do we get scored equally or not? So it's something that's kind of evolving, and we'll keep an eye on it.
Cameron?
Thanks. So maybe Cameron didn't have a question.
All right. Any other questions?
I don't see anybody.
So I'm not going to, oops. So I think now I'm just going to leave it on the screen here. It's just, we have time, we have 10 minutes. Does anybody have any other project or program updates they'd like to share with the group? Peter?
So I've got 3 quick ones. We've sent out our draft transportation system plan project memo to our local partners for their input and comment. We'll get that back early this month, and then they take a look at it, see if we need to change anything. We've got draft chapters we've reviewed internally for bike ped and some of the other stuff. And so we hope in November to go out with an online version for public comment of our draft transportation system plan. In terms of Tumalo, we have a TGM grant from DLCD, which is for active transportation. So we've been working with CET on the transit component on that, doing some bike ped work as well. So that'll go online in October, the TGM grant for more comment from the Tumaloians. Updating the Tumalo community plan overall, that's going to go on hold until January. We're waiting for, there's a sewer feasibility study the road department's doing for Tumalo, and that's kind of burbling along. So we're going to wait for the Tumalo community plan overall update till the sewer feasibility study is done first, because the public keeps getting confused. I go to a Tumalo community plan open house and I'm fielding sewer question after sewer question. So I'm like, look, that's not the meeting we're having. But the sewer feasibility study has got a lot of Tumalo understandably worked up for a variety of reasons. And then the rural trails, part of the TGM grant for sisters, we're going to have some public comment on that in October. So that's all I've got, unless you got any questions for me. Thank you, Rachel, for going to all those open houses.
All right, Robin.
I just wanted to give an update. The city, I know we've talked about a more collective process, but we are starting a wayfinding project for bike, one north-south and one east-west bike facility with an overarching branding theme. We're working on our RFP and getting a consultant on board by the middle of January.
Exciting. Good. Anything else, Robin?
Nope.
All right. Rick?
Oh, just update on a couple of plans we've got going. The Reed Market study, consultant teams working hard on that right now. I'm still trying to put together the membership on the Stakeholder Advisory Committee. The Highway 20 facility plan, that's also active. Going to need some volunteers for that Stakeholder Advisory Committee, and I'm open to any suggestions people have. I just asked Peter Russell to join the Technical Advisory Committee. Henry, I was going to invite you onto the Technical Advisory Committee, but I'm thinking that the focus is mostly on the trail that goes through the House Bill 4079 project. So I thought I would not drag you into several 3-hour meetings when we could just reach out to you individually.
Thank you for sparing me, Rick. I appreciate it.
That's all I had.
All right. Any other updates?
I've just got a really quick one. We're gonna, if you're a frequent trail user of the Deschutes River Trail, we're starting our the riparian restoration project in River Bend Park. We're gonna break ground on that next week. And so a portion of the trail on River left in between our offices and the Bill Healy Bridge is going to be closed for the duration of the project. I'm not sure of the exact timeline, but I believe it's going to extend through the fall and part of the winter. But yeah, that's a partnership with the Upper Deschutes Watershed Council, and we're really, really excited to do some more restoration work near our office and on the river.
Henry, just a quick question on that. Does the restoration, the bigger restoration project, does that extend through the length of, will it be through the length of Bend?
So we completed a study a number of years ago that looked at multiple projects throughout the whole river corridor, looking at access and environmental restoration. That was the genesis of the upcoming project work we're going to be doing at Columbia Park and Millers Park to do some riparian restoration. Is that what you're referring to, Tyler?
Well, yeah, I just know that, I mean, because there's retaining walls, or there's old retaining walls along much of the river in various locations throughout the city. And, I mean, some of those walls are in better shape than others, and there's pieces falling out here and there. And I was just wondering, like, longer term, is the intention to pull most of those retaining walls and put in more of a natural a natural edge?
Yeah, I'm not sure the answer to that. I know Brian ran into some issues with those walls being considered a historic feature in the Drake Park project. And I know it seems kind of funny, but I guess they're more than 50 years old. I think that they may have had to change plans a little bit, but I think they are still removing a fair amount of the walls in Drake Park. I don't know if they have to leave a small portion or what their agreement was. But in terms of larger plans for restoration projects throughout the river, we're using that river access plan as kind of our guidebook. And we'll be trying to fund projects and get grants for projects moving forward. We just approved last night at our board meeting a concept for a large reconfiguration and restoration project in Sawyer Park. So we're going to be tearing out the old parking lot and most likely moving that closer to the roadway and doing some habitat restoration and trying to consolidate some of our green spaces within that park over the next couple of years.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
Yeah.
Hey, Henry, regarding your board meetings, I know they were going to talk about, or you get to give a briefing on the Deschutes River Trail. I was curious how the infamous Southern Bridge Crossing bike ped discussion went.
Yeah, I guess I was trying to avoid PTSD for anyone that was involved in that project years ago, but I did. So last night staff gave our board an update on the South UGB Bridge project. We haven't been working on that since 2019, but we have pretty much a whole new board of directors. There's only one that was around when that project was worked on last time. So we gave them a history of the project and kind of brought everyone up to speed. We're not officially restarting the project at this time, but a community group named Connect Bend, which is an advocacy group that formed to try to garner support to get us to restart that project. They gave a small presentation and made their case. We haven't made any decisions yet, nor do I know if we will at any time in the near future on that project. But I didn't get shouted out of the room, Peter, if that's what you were wondering.
All right. Anyone have anything else to share? All right. Well, our next TAC meeting is scheduled for November 2nd, and I think we're going to be having the STBG project application discussion at that meeting. Is that correct, Andrea?
Yeah, so that would be the time when applicants would have the opportunity to present their projects to the TAC.
And so that'll probably be the bulk of that meeting, but we may have another topic or two as well. So, and that is all I have. So with that, we will adjourn the meeting.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you,
Everybody-
everyone.
Bye, everyone.